Okay, so we are officially on the home stretch now. The only thing left to do on each of these 4 pieces of furniture is to install the tops, or build and install the tops. So you might be wondering why up to this point I haven't shown any footage of the nearly completed pieces, and that's purely because I'm trying to build up some anticipation for you guys. And you'll get to see how all this stuff looks when it's completely finished, and I promise you guys, it's looking dang good. Now the trick is that there's a lot of other stuff that still has to come together. You know, this furniture still has to sit for a couple weeks while I watch it, just to make sure that nothing's moving weirdly. And so over that time, things might change from what you guys saw in the videos and that. So I'm just waiting to kind of see what changes, what happens with this furniture while it's sitting, so that before I show it off too much, I know that it's something that's actually going to work out properly. But anyway, what we're going to be working on today is getting the tops glued up. And so we've got 4 panels that we need to get glued up. It's going to be a little bit of a painful process, I'm not going to lie. But it is also not going to be too complicated, I don't think. Because the nice thing about these tops compared to basically any other top I've worked on in the past is I specifically made it sure with these tops that I can do it all on the machinery that I have. Okay, so I said there's only a few areas where I was going to stop and actually talk about the process here, and this is one of the important things. So far we've gone through, milled up all the stock, it's all perfectly flat, and I started gluing it up. And so one of the reasons I wanted to stop here and talk about the glue up is because I get a lot of questions about why I don't use dowels, dominoes, tongue and groove, anything like that. I don't use any kind of joinery for my panel glue ups. Because if you look anywhere on YouTube, a lot of the woodworkers will tell you that you need to use dowels for alignment. Dowels add a ton of strength to your glue ups and really help create a strong panel. And the funniest thing is that that's just a complete farce. Now it's not like Festool put out this rumor to make themselves more money using the domino or anything like that. It's just a common misconception. Because where it comes from is if you have a section of a tabletop, let's say, that is overhanging. So if you think of like a kitchen island or something where you've got most of the top is going to be supported, then there's going to be maybe 18 inches that's overhanging. That's an area where adding in some dominoes or some dowels might actually create a little bit of extra strength. It'll create a little bit more rigidity compared to just doing a standard glue up like I'm doing here. That is kind of the one area where that strength may actually be necessary. But for here, dowels or dominoes are not going to add any extra strength because the top is supported the whole way through. Then the other point of that is alignment. One of the big troubles that I had when I started woodworking is I followed that mantra of using dowels for alignment. But then the problem is on a top like this that is 61 inches long, you then have to put in multiple dowels across the 5 different pieces here, and you have to make sure that every single one of those dowels lines up, which is the biggest, most challenging thing, because what I had on quite a few tops where I tried to use dowels for alignment is, 5 of the 6 dowels that I put in were just fine, but that 6th one was completely out of alignment, so I either just didn't have that whole alignment piece in that one area, or I had to end up re-drilling a hole near that one, and then I either had to fill that, and it was just a lot of extra work. And in reality, if you've done everything else properly, so you're using a jointer to get everything nice and flat, you're using a planer to get everything down to proper thickness, and most importantly, you're using a table saw on both edges of your board to make sure that it is perfectly 90 degrees, that is where you're going to get a good panel glue up, and you're not going to need any alignment. And the biggest problem is if you're using dowels or dominoes, that's just a ton of time to take to individually drill each of those holes, or even with the domino, individually going through and cutting each of those holes. It's just a ton of wasted time. Whereas here, what you can see what I've done is I'm just using a whole bunch of pipe clamps, a whole bunch of F-style clamps just to bring in a little bit of extra strength, and then I'm using some hardwood cauls. Now, hardwood cauls are the most important thing to have in your shop for doing panel glue ups. Because like I said before, this top here is 61 inches long. That is a long piece. These are long pieces of wood. No matter what I do, these pieces are going to not want to cooperate with me as I'm trying to get them all clamped up and square. So the best way to keep these flat is by using these cauls going across the wood like that in 3 separate locations, kind of near the end and then right in the middle. That is going to force all of these pieces to be perfectly flat. Alright guys, so the joinery on the breadboard ends is now cut. I didn't stop and talk about this, kind of a preamble kind of thing, because I've done that a lot. Every single project I do that has a tabletop on it, I use breadboard ends. And this is one of the things that I think is so important with fine furniture, is that anytime you have a tabletop, you want to put some breadboard ends on it, because it is really not that hard, especially when you get practice at it. Because right now, after doing all these ones that I had to do for this bedroom set, I can get all of this part fitted up in about half an hour, which is pretty fast. It could probably be faster, but this is, pretty good. And so that really doesn't add that much time to the overall, all the time that it takes to make a nice tabletop. And it really makes a massive difference because it means that this whole panel is going to stay nice and flat, and it just looks really cool. Okay, so the panels are all glued up now. Everything's looking good. Gluing up breadboard ends when you don't need clamps is such a satisfying thing because you're just putting the pegs in the holes, everything holds together, and this, it's a completely traditional joint. It's just super cool in that way. And so one thing I do want to mention is that the way that I drilled the holes was not a good idea on my own part. Looking at it in hindsight, I've done this in the past before. Usually it works out just fine, but in this case, some of the holes are going to have some issues. And all that happened is that some of our holes, rather than being exactly 3/8 of an inch round, they got enlarged slightly on our outer pieces here. So although not the end of the world, it could be a little bit better. It just means that I have some small gaps that I need to fill. So like I said, could be better, but not that big of a deal. So the proper way to do that would be to mark your hole location just using a brad point bit, take off the end, then drill your hole so you don't have run the risk of enlarging that outside hole, because obviously that's going to be your most visible location. You don't want that getting damaged while you're trying to drill that bit of the hole through the tenon there. So that aside, now we're on to the actual finishing stage of this. And so there's one important thing that I did here that is going to really help me in the finishing stage, and that is I left my end pieces a little bit thicker. So when I was doing all my milling, I ran all my pieces through the planer to the exact same thickness. Then when I glued up my panel, I then ran my panel through the drum sander, but I didn't do any sanding on the end pieces. So they stayed just slightly thicker, maybe a 64th of an inch thicker. But what this now has done is now I now have about a hairline, just barely noticeable sticking up over both ends. So I just have to go over that with my hand plane. And what this allows me to do is to just correct any error. And so I'm going to start by using my hand plane to clean up all of the actual joinery areas. So the actual ends themselves, we're going to clean all that up with the hand planes, using the block plane to first knock down where the dowels are still sticking out a little bit. And then going over the whole thing with the low angle jack with a 50-degree blade in it to knock down the thickness of those ends so that they're the exact same as our main panel. Then it's on to sanding. Now, as everyone knows, sanding sucks. It's just one of those things that you have to do. Now, in my shop, I have a lot of ways to get around the horrible part of sanding. I've got my drum sander, which I use for the majority of the sanding that I need to do. I use my hand plane on areas where I can't cover with my drum sander. And I do a little bit of hand sanding now and then when I can get away with it. Now, the problem is on a breadboard end top like this, there's really nothing else you can do but using a random orbital sander to get a nice finish on it. You can't use a scraper or a hand plane on it because those require you to go with the grain. And as soon as you go across the grain, even by accident with that hand plane or that scraper, you're going to cause massive damage to the grains and you're not going to get a good clean finish. So if you're very careful, you could theoretically use a hand plane on the main panel here and then use a hand plane across the ends to clean up whatever areas you screwed up. Now again, that runs a whole bunch of different risks that is just not worthwhile. So like I said, sanding really is the only way to do this. And so there's one final thing I want to talk about that I completely forgot to take any video footage of. I don't know why I didn't think of this, but that is repairing cracks. Now you can see on the bottom of the wide dresser, of the top for the wide dresser here, I've got a whole row of bow ties going across here. Now, I knew that these pieces of wood were cracked, I knew that they had checks in them, and I knew that I was going to have to fix them, but the piece of wood looked so good on the other side that I didn't want to just waste it. And this is one of the benefits of making a tabletop is you don't have to use your best quality pieces of wood in your shop. You can use some of your second grade quality stuff, it might have one really nice side, and might have another side that's all checked and cracked and looks like garbage. Because what you can do is if you put that side on the bottom and you do some filling like this, like I've done here, the other side looks great and you can use it just as a normal board. Like I said, I completely forgot to take any footage of making the bow ties, inlaying them here and all that, just because it seemed more like a utilitarian thing than anything. But I'm actually impressed with how well they came out, and they're going to be a great addition to this piece because it's going to just keep this whole top, all these little checks that are in here, it's going to keep them from spreading more. Now, in most cases, most of these checks that are in here are not anything that is most likely going to spread, but I wanted to make sure that I went in and fixed them, permanently. Because we do have a couple, especially the ones on the end here, these are pretty big and these may spread, but now I don't have to worry about them spreading anymore. Most of the other ones on the end here are just kind of superficial ones. All right, so I've got the top for the tall dresser in front of me now. The top side of it is sanded up to 180 grit. The back side is sanded up to 150 grit. And now we can start doing the other stuff to it. So the first thing we're going to do is add our rounded over profile. So we're going to be using, I believe it's either an 1/8 inch or 3/16 inch round over profile. The same one we used a couple other places on this bedroom set. And we're just going to run around the edges here. Now this is a very subtle round over profile compared to what I would typically do on something like this, because that's very much so the look I'm going for here. I don't want it to look like it has a rounded edge. I just want it round over the edge so that it's not sharp and dangerous. And so one of the important things to figure out when you're working on your tops like this is when to add your edge profiles and when to do your water popping, which you need to do on this one. And so in this case, we're stopping at 220 grit. So right now with it sanded up to 180 grit, I want to go through, add all my edge profiles, and then do my water pop. That way, when I do my final finish sanding of 220 grit, that's the last sanding I need to do. Now, the important thing is that you don't want to add your edge profile before you do all your sanding. You want to at least get up to 180 grit before you're adding your edge profiles, because anything below 180 grit, you're removing a decent amount of material. So if before I did anything, I got my panel flattened like you guys saw with the hand plane, and then I added my edge profiles, well, when I was doing the 80 grit sanding, that takes off a lot of material. And so if I have a nice round over like I'm going for here, that rounded over profile will get flattened by that 80 grit sanding, because you're removing a lot of material during that 80 grit sanding. You'd end up with kind of this, awkwardly, partially rounded over corner that has kind of a flat transition into it. Now, knowing that my only grit that I have left to sand on here is 220 grit, I know that 220 grit is not going to be removing a ton of material. So I know that rounded over profile is not really going to be deeply affected by getting sanded over.